Safety, beauty, the human scale. These are values which men want, but which many men feel have left the center city. They are what is sought in the small urban cell that Doxiadis envisions. But if it is not to lapse into a conventional suburb, the cell must have a life relatively independent of the big city organism it is attached to. It has to support all the basic needs of the people who live in it. This means that the new town, instead of providing an escape from human problems, must plan to face them and cope with them. This is the range of planning that has gone into one small new city that is now being built within one of the nation's densest urban sprawls, the limited space between Washington and Baltimore.
This is the new town of Columbia, Maryland, an area slightly bigger than Manhattan Island, designed to house 110,000 persons in comfort of body, mind, and spirit. Its developers call it the Next America, and they like to claim that it is unique among all the new towns now being developed.
The really important thing and the unique thing about Columbia is the process by which it has been created. We started with a group of 14 people, doctors, ministers, educators, sociologists, and we said, we're going to build a new city. What's the best possible education system we can think of? What's the best possible health system? What's the best communication system? How can you make religion the most effective possible force in the growth of people? Let's forget about whether it's feasible. Let's just assume we can do whatever we want to do. It's the best we know.
If it is, in fact, unique, it is certainly not because of its architecture, which avoids the way-out modern and resembles, in this Next America, nothing so much as the present and past Americas. And that's part of the point. Columbia is designed to sell, not to win architectural prizes. Some apartments will rent for $75 a month. Some homes with large lots will sell for $50,000 and more. And they're being occupied even faster than expected, as fast as they can be built. Possibly, homes in this area would sell just as fast without a project like Columbia. This area is between Baltimore and Washington, just 37 miles apart, the two closest large cities in the nation, two of the fastest growing. This is the corridor down which the great Boston to Washington megalopolis is rapidly sweeping. Again, developer James Rouse.
We would hope that we might exert some influence on the nature of that megalopolis being very different than it will otherwise be. I think there's a growing intolerance in America with just the sprawl of megalopolis and a growing yearning for a much richer sense of community. And that's what we think we're dealing with. We've been very careful about the business of scale. We will be a city really of 9 small towns or villages, each of 10 to 15,000 people. Each of those villages breaks down into 4 to 6 neighborhoods. And at the heart of each neighborhood are the things that people can best do at that scale of people. The child care center, the elementary school, a park, swimming pool, a little store. And at the villages occur those village centers, those things that can best be done at the scale of a village. The supermarket and bank and other stores, a youth center, a library, a theater, the churches, the tennis club, and a high school and a junior high school. And then at the heart of downtown, serving the whole community, are the department stores and hospital and college and concert halls and restaurants and theater, the life of the city. And all of these village centers in downtown are connected by a bus system that serves the whole community and that interrelates it.
Columbia is designed to be a self-contained city. That means not just homes, but business and recreation areas. More than 30,000 people will work in Columbia eventually, and several business firms have already moved in. The downtown Pavilion of Music has become the summer home of the National Symphony Orchestra. Throughout all 9 villages, the idea is to mix rich and poor, old and young, apartments and private homes, to avoid the uniform quality of most suburbs. Like other new towns, Columbia is already a tourist attraction. Visitors flock in on weekends to ride the minibuses, try the lakes and woods, and look over the exhibits on living in the Next America. The 2,000 people already living there are always ready to tell visitors what it's like.
I have the first drugstore in the village center here, in the first village to be built here in Columbia.
I think that it's very important to live close to your business. I think that if you're in business in a community like this, that you should be an active part of it.
Do you expect to get rich here?
No, not rich financially. I think we will be well off financially. I think we will be very, very comfortable. But again, my thoughts on this go back to the community. There's an awful lot of facets in this community which will make me rich in many, many other ways.
If you had to put your finger on the one thing that sold you on Columbia, what would you say it was?
I think it was the exhibit. The exhibit explicitly indicated that Negroes were welcome to the community.
And has it worked out that way, in fact,
Yes,
for you?
it has. I feel that the city in itself is something near to a utopia due to the fact that we read every day in the papers the Negro does not have the is not in a position to move to the suburbs because of the
prejudices.
Yes, right.
Right.
But here I was welcomed, and the reception that I received when I applied for an apartment was very warm, and it made me feel as though I was really wanted here as a resident.
The main thing we need to be sure of is that we start this city off on the basis where the villages are real. They are real in that they represent a cross-section of people by income level, and that it works. And it is working. It's working today, and we will continue to use every resourceful device we can to provide housing for people of very modest income. And then, of course, in time, we will develop our own indigent, as any community surely does. There'll be disaffected people, there'll be alcoholics, there'll be people who are losers in our society, and our hope would be that the community itself will have a better capacity to respond and deal with those infirmities among us than a sprawling, disrelated suburban situation in which people really aren't brought together in community so that they can respond to need. This is, I guess, our highest hope.
It's highly doubtful, of course, that the residents being pulled into this rapidly developing Baltimore-Washington corridor are much concerned with either high finance or sociology. What they need, obviously, is a place to live. And the attractive, colorful, planned city of Columbia is selling them houses as fast as they can be built. The verdict on Columbia so far, in the only way that matters to businessmen, is yes, spelled out in down payment checks.
The eastern population corridor already reaches from south of Washington, north and east, all the way to Boston and beyond. What the second school of urban philosophers seeks is to break out of the crowded corridor and build where no new city will impinge on another, where there is room and air to breathe, where the new constructions and ideas can be more radical. Most parts of America are underpopulated. Build there, says the second school. Once it might have been necessary to construct cities on natural sites with an existing harbor or river channel or a natural trail which made a place accessible. Now such considerations have been outmoded by the power of modern engines which can shape nature, which can create harbors or cut trails or place landing plateaus in areas that were once inaccessible. Two men who share this thesis, even if they sometimes disagree on ways to implement it, are Athelstan Spilhaus, the South Africa-born experimenter with urban ideas, and Louis Mumford, who has made the study of cities his life. They talked to David Culhane.
Let's look at the ways in which people are now trying to solve the problems of the city. What do you think is wrong with the urban renewal approach?
First of all, they try to rehouse. Although there's so many things that are wrong, I find it very hard to begin with, to focus on one. Principally, they were trying to rehouse the people in the urban renewal districts at the same slum densities at which they were originally there. These people need more air and more space, more playgrounds. They need some of the amenities of a real community. And as soon as you attempt to build high-rise buildings, you destroy these things. And very often, they're almost irreplaceable. Because when you drive out the little shopkeeper, the local doctor, the various other people who perform services in an urban community. You drive out its life. And buildings can't replace life.
Given the limitations of space in the city, how do you avoid such things as high-rise renewal projects?
A very simple way. You build elsewhere. Open up the central city and decrease the pressure of demand. Then you might begin to give the same qualities, the same advantages of open spaces and freedom of movement to the central city. But you can't do it while the central city is being more and more crowded.
In other words, you would move people to the outskirts of the city.
No, I'd move them even further than the outskirts. I'd move them over a much larger regional area. To take the case of New York. The New York State Office for Regional Development a few years ago pointed out that New York could be, the state of New York could be divided into 10 metropolitan districts, each one of which is surrounded now by open country.
In other words, you would have smaller cities spread across each state.
Many smaller cities, not just spread across at random, but in relation to smaller metropolitan districts. The point is we must think of the city not as an isolated unit. It's part of the new city, is not just a mere spread of population over the Atlantic seaboard, megalopolis. That's not a city at all. That's just a name for a foul process.
Well, some authorities seem to think that people prefer to live in the piled-up way they do in the central cities.
It's always easy to justify any human institution by saying that a lot of people like to live that way. On such a basis, one could defend prostitution, one could defend almost anything. Thieves like to hang together, too. This isn't a real justification. I think what we have to realize is that the people have different degrees of tolerance for living in communities. Some people like to be close together. Some people like to be far apart. Not everybody in a heap, in a large mass, clotted mass of people. Not everybody's dispersed in suburban and ex-urban communities, but with little nodes of concentration, real cities connecting to form a unit of maybe 10 or 15 million people.
Really, the essence of the experimental city is to try to build complete, new, controlled-sized cities in the open lands of the United States. Hopefully to build them with new technologies so that people by choice will choose to move from the overcrowded older cities to these new communities. In other words, you can visualize dispersed cities all over the United States. I like to say that we'll put these cities with the advantages of city living in the open land and thereby open up land in the older cities and improve conditions everywhere.
Could you give me a specific idea of what this new community would look like?
I can't tell you what it would look like because that's the freedom of architecture and the variety that we would want to exist in the experimental city. The experimental city would, if you looked inside it, there would be a great substructure. Now the substructure could either be excavated if the land was suitable for excavation, or you could raise the ground level. When I talk about underground, I mean under the lowest level where people will walk. And in the experimental city, I visualize that at ground level there'll be no wheeled traffic, and it'll be people can walk all around there. Underneath that would be a rabbit warren of tunnels, tunnels to take out the wastes to processing plants outside, tunnels for the emergency vehicles, special tunnels for ambulances, for fire, police, and so forth. There would be fume sewers to take off whatever gases the businesses and factories generated. There would be perhaps pneumatic or some other way of delivering mail, and all these things would be open underground. So one thing we'd get away from is digging up the streets. Snow removal, if that was a problem, would be just by kind of opening up the street and dumping it down a hole which would be underground. Possibly one could even use this nice cold water from winter to do the cooling in summer. There are all kinds of technologies one can experiment with.
How big would your model city be?
This is part of the experiment, and I mean, when I first proposed the idea, I just picked on a figure of 250,000. I suspect that's too small to give the number of choices that people want in a city. It could be, maybe we want dispersed cities of different sizes, because there again, you give people choices in what kind of size of city they want to live in. But the essential thing is that if we have a city of 1 million, let's build the networks to serve that city of 1 million and not allow the population growth there. The way you control the growth of the population of a city is, of course, by controlling the business and earning opportunities there.
Well, are you suggesting then that we should dismantle the cities as they currently exist?
No, absolutely not. And I think it's very important to say that the experimental city and the dispersed city idea is not an alternative to doing what we must do, and very urgently, and that is do the day-by-day fixing of our existing cities. This is very urgent, and I admire those people who have the almost impossible job day by day of working in the older cities. I think there have been magnificent things done here in Philadelphia, in the city, against tremendous odds. But we must at the same time have a long-range plan, make a step jump, looking toward solving the problem 25 years from now. And that is what the Experimental City Project is for.
A big new metropolis, a city of 3 million people with its various levels of transport and communications, its composition of rich and poor and in between, its full complement of industry and culture. All this is hard to imagine in a country that already seems crowded with decaying New Yorks and Chicagos and Clevelands, with dozens of burgeoning places like Atlanta and Miami and Houston. Yet in the foreseeable future, there may be added to the list of the nation's larger cities the unfamiliar name of Irvine. Irvine, California, may grow to be an example of what Lewis Mumford and Athelstan Spilhaus see as the city of the future. It is being planned on wide open land, on a stretch of Pacific shoreline between Los Angeles and San Diego. Now a sparsely populated community, will be a varied metropolis of as many as 3 million people in 30 years, if current projections are correct. It has been planned that way from the first groundbreaking back in 1960. Bill Stout went to the headquarters of Irvine's chief planner, William Pereira.
Can you show us on this map, Mr. Pereira, how the new city of Irvine is going to come into being?
Well, I think, first of all, I ought to give you some idea of what size area we're looking at here. This is about a third of the Irvine Ranch. And what you're looking at is about the size of the city of San Francisco, city of Paris. Actually, what we're dealing with is not a town of itself, but an oncoming megalopolis, in which this area here will probably do a great deal towards inspiring the growth of the other towns and the balance of the urbanization.
As I understand it, sir, your starting concept was to construct an urban development around the university. Does that still hold?
It does very much so. University represents about 1,500 acres, and it will contain eventually about 28,000 students. Now, our research shows that 27 to 28,000 students will generate a population of itself of about 125,000 people. In finding this location for the university, we had a number of, well, we had 100,000 acres really, which is what the Irvine Ranch consists of, to choose from. We chose this because it was close enough to recreation and industry and jobs, because most of the students work nowadays. And incidentally, this is fundamental to the development of all new towns historically. there's a tendency to confuse new towns with new subdivisions. But new towns start with a place to work and a desire to live somewhere. And it's this working that has caused the unusual, rapid development of Irvine.
How much of it can we see, Mr. Pereira, if we go outside?
I think you can see quite a bit. Around here is the industrial area. It's about 5,000 acres and will ultimately contain about 20,000 some odd jobs. We have since 1960 placed about 15,000 jobs here. This, for example, is Ford Philco in here. Douglas Astropower is here. This entire area here is a interesting and new kind of housing development, ranging all the way from single-family housing to apartments and so-called condominiums. Over here is what we think will be the urban center for a region from, say, Long Beach clear down to San Diego. And this is the new town center for Irvine. Since about 1960, when we started the master planning down here, I would guess that there are 90 to 100,000 more people here than there were then.
Is Irvine a completely planned city, Mr. Pereira? What areas are there that will be left to individual decision, individual choice?
No, Irvine is not planned in the sense that there's a road and for every place and a thing for a land use for every piece of land. It's a series of ideas, all of which have tremendous relationship to one another, so that as the people themselves populate the land, their own ambitions and their own ideas will take effect.
What provisions are there to give lower income groups, minority group members, access to living in Irvine?
Well, there are no special provisions. There is no prohibition. The inspiration for the town of Irvine is the university, certainly a democratic form in itself and populated by faculty and students alike of all races and creeds. And I think that it will be the newcomers that will shape the complexion of this area,
rather than vice versa.
And I think that's been true. It's a question of who gets assimilated here.
In new cities in the making, like Irvine, California, and Columbia, Maryland, in revitalized old cities like Philadelphia, we've seen some promise of solutions to the urban crisis that has closed down around our urban society like its own polluted atmosphere. It's a crisis of neglect and decay that, as we've seen in these three broadcasts, has undermined housing and education and health, has blighted the life and the look of our cities, spoiled the very spirit of the city, turning it from excitement to peril. Can this deadly process be reversed? Can the beginnings of reform be extended from limited experiment to American society as a whole? Our correspondents called upon three expert witnesses to offer their testimony as to what is at stake and what are the prospects.
It's the greatest possible assemblage of human talent, different human vocations, different human aptitudes, different cultural traditions. All these things come together in the city. You might say that the city was the biggest brain that any community has ever been able to put together. Compared to the city, the computer is a dwarf. The city is a marvelous assemblage of intellectual and emotional and spiritual power. Therefore, there's no substitute for the city. We need this big brain if our civilization is to continue.
Suppose we continue in the way we've been going. What would you foresee in the American city in, let's say, 50 years?
I wouldn't give the American city 50 years. I would foresee disaster a much earlier period than that. The central city would be deserted. Violence would grow, no matter who remained there to keep things going. And the disorganization of life would go on, the misspending of money on the wrong services, on the wrong policies would go on, and our whole urban civilization would be in such a chaotic state that I would expect a reaction from it before it reached the final lowest depth.
You have estimated that the cost of rehabilitating America's cities would amount to trillions of dollars. Do we Americans, in your estimation, have the will and the money to put that kind of resources into the job?
Well, when I say trillions, I mean it because it involves so much. It involves practically rebuilding your cities, changing your whole transportation system, breaking up the fiscal and financial boundaries, which are very irrational. When I say trillions, I also added that it will take at least a generation. This is nothing which you do right away.
Well, do we have the will, in your estimation? You know a good deal about us as an objective outsider. Do you sense that kind of commitment in the United States?
Well, let me first say whether you have the means. Surely you have the means, but the fact that you do not recognize that you have to spend all that money in that direction shows that you have wrong priorities. It's not only the Congress, it's the American people. There is no parliament in the world I know which reflects public opinion as perfectly and accurately as the American Congress. When you say the will doesn't exist now. But will you allow me to add a thing? Nevertheless, you can never find me about the defeatists about America. I have never belonged to those, even under difficult circumstances, who said that it can happen here. And you see, the feeling I have is that there is also no country which can so rapidly change opinion as America.
I do have faith that Americans are pragmatists, and they have a great deal of common sense. Their reputations worldwide has been built on the basis that Americans are doers. And if we have a chaotic and dangerous situation in our central city areas, and perhaps increasingly in the suburbs around them, I think Americans ultimately will cope with the problem because they have to. And if we don't, we can see a deterioration in Western civilization as we know it.
The faith expressed in America's ability to save its cities and thus itself is based on this country's talent for change on a grand scale. A range of experts have suggested the shape and scope of change needed. First, a drastic shift in money priorities, massive allocations by the U.S. government each year to help finance urban change, which has become a burden far too heavy for local business and the local community. Second, a basic reform in the structure of local government, some kind of metropolitan administration, so that the additional money could be put where it is needed, so regional problems could be met regionally. Third, to introduce on a wide scale city planning, shaping communities according to social need instead of by accident, using space-age technology for down-to-earth problems. Fourth, creating new cities instead of just loading more suburbs onto the overburdened existing cities, using our open lands. And fifth, and above all, our inquiry has shown that the crisis of the cities cannot be separated from the crisis of the races. Confining the Negro has impoverished the cities and made urban solutions enormously difficult. A temporary solution, we have seen, is improvement of life within the black ghetto, as long as we don't embalm it there. We also have examined the longer-range solution, which a growing number of Americans define as the full acceptance of the Negro into American society, giving him the range of American choice. In the course of the last half-century, this country has demonstrated its talent for great change. It scrapped isolation and tooled up for wars. It revised the role of government to cope with depression. It grew mankind's greatest technology. It launched adventures into space. To solve the crisis in the cities is the greatest test of all.